Okay. Actually, I grew up in Ann Arbor, and I am a member of the silent generation, as you know. And in the foundation world, we talk about generations a lot, particularly in the family foundation world, and so that's sort of why I'm throwing that in. But I have always thought that I was really much more a part of the World War II generation, because the World War II started almost right after my 8th birthday.
Okay.
My father was in a medical unit that the University of Michigan put together. And so they left, and when they left, they got on a train in Ann Arbor, and nobody knew whether the train was going to go east or west, where it was going to go, whether they were going to end up in Europe or Africa or in the Pacific. And they didn't know where their husbands, and in some cases wives, were for probably 3 weeks until they finally arrived in England. And so that was almost 4 years of being the oldest child in a single-parent family with 3 younger sisters. And I think that was in many respects transformative. I told a story the other night about when I was 10, my mother took me to New York. And we were having dinner with a friend of the family whose brother was actually my father's tent mate. And that was when we were just beginning to hear about the Nazi atrocities. And all of a sudden, Sister stopped and she said, "Well, Margaret, you probably don't want me to talk to Ranny about this." And Mother said, "No, you can say anything you want to in front of Ranny. She needs to know what's going on." And that's just a total attitudinal. You're 10 years old, but you have to be responsible. And I think that's one of the things that made a huge impact on me, always, as part of that. Which doesn't mean I was ever perfect. That I still picked on my little sisters and didn't like to do things and all that good stuff. Pudgy, horse crazy. All little girls are horse crazy. Probably little girls at 10 are bigger than little boys at 10, because also when I was 10, my female classmates and I staged our first sit-down strike. And this is terrible. We had a teacher who was probably very ADD, because she was really a terrible teacher, but she was really into modern dance. And so the girls all had to take modern dance. And the boys got to march twice a week. And we had ROTC drilling right outside the school all the time. The boys got to do that kind of stuff. We had to be flowers unfolding, great, wonderful things like that. And so we staged a sit-down strike. Well, Juliana decided to cry. And so everybody but one other girl and I got up. So she grabbed us and she pulled us up and swatted us. And that was the end of our strike. So I learned something about the effectiveness of strikes.
Yes.
But that's the kind of little girl I was when I was 10. I'll finish the story then, because actually I would have had the same teacher in the 6th grade, and some mother went to the principal, and this is the University Lab School in the University of Michigan. Probably would hate it if I ever told about it. They knew I was telling this story, but I think Deborah Ball has heard it. And she said, because Mother had been a student teacher there. But the principal said, "Well, Margaret, you know we don't fire a teacher. We wait for her to realize she's a failure and retire." So Mother said, "All right." And she went to the dean of the ed school and said, "I want Ranny to skip the 6th grade." So I started 7th grade when I was 10 years old. Wow. I took remedial math, because part of the problem was this wonderful teacher only took multiplication one day, addition one day, subtraction one day, division. I mean,
oh my gosh.
And I ended up working at the farmer's market that spring before I skipped, so that I could at least learn to make change and count out plants. And well, there was an entirely different kind of disciplinary figure in our lives all of a sudden again. And I really do think women totally operate differently in men, and that we are much more consensual. And my mother was strict, and we did what we were told to do. But it wasn't like when Harry came home. And then there was also that wonderful person that I never had there saying, and don't talk back to your mother. That John never did that for me. But also he really and truly became one of my best friends.
Oh, that's so wonderful. Yeah.
And my interests really are science, and he was a doctor. And
Yes. Yeah. And they taught lessons in philanthropy to you, or was this something you just?
we talk about this, but when it's something that's going on all the time, and so you don't have to talk about it. Mm-hmm. But I can remember sitting, particularly when we come to Midland and having lunch with my grandmother, and they'd be talking about the different people who they were helping or organizations. And so it was just lunch table conversation or dinner table conversation. Mm-hmm. And, basically it always has been.
Just part of life.
Yeah.
Part of life.
I mean, I will say one of the things I'm going to do with my trustees when I have 2 new trustees and some new associate trustees coming in a couple of weeks, and to talk about, because my mother always told me that when she was growing up, that when they earned any money and she babysat some of my cousins who are older than I am, my grandparents' family is almost split in 2 halves. Mm-hmm. And so my oldest cousin is 93 right now. And then there's one who's probably close to 90. And then I'm the oldest, and that's a little gap in there between us. But if mother earned any money, one fraction of it had to be reinvested in the Dow Chemical Company. One fraction of it had to go, the same fraction had to go in the church plate. And the third part was hers. And the funny thing is, and Dottie could tell you who the Rockefeller sister who used to be chairman of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund was, but she told exactly the same story about that's the way she was brought up. And and it really is, and I have to say, I certainly didn't bring up my children to say you have to save, you have to give, and the what's in equal parts, and then what's left you may get. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Although I have to say they both do pretty well in their own ways.
Yeah. I wanted to just go back a minute and ask you, who's the silent generation?
The silent generation are those of us who were born during the Depression. And my youngest sister is a baby boomer, and as is my daughter. Mm-hmm. And my youngest sister was born after World War II. Okay. So.
And what are the characteristics of the silent generation?
I don't know. I think somebody thought we were silent. We were essentially passive. And
they were wrong.
I don't think so.
Yeah. I was wondering if it was that silent generation that was, there were so many people, the World War II veterans, and so many baby boomers
that we were squeezed in between.
Yeah.
And I think we sort of were, but
look at the influence you've had on them.
A lot of us actually learned to speak up for ourselves.
At age 10.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I was a political activist before I was.
Oh, before? Okay.
Oh, well, yeah. I mean, if you take things chronologically, which is rather strange. And again, a lot of this is my mother's influence, because when I did not go to the University of Michigan, by the way. I'd had enough after 12 years or however many. Yes. And I went to Carleton College in Minnesota, and I really was a zoology major. Okay. And then I went to Mount Holyoke and did graduate work. And like every other young woman in the 50s, then I got married. Mm-hmm. And my husband was in the Army for 3 years after we were married, and we were stationed at the Pentagon. Okay. And 3 years of being a good officer's wife was
I like you.
No, sometimes we play what if, and what if, because John had a colonel who really tried to get him to stay in the Army, and he kept saying, well, John, Ranny likes dress blues, and she wants to go to Alaska, and I can guarantee you Alaska for the next 3 years if you'll just stay in. Unfortunately, we didn't do that, but we did start playing what if a few years ago, what would have happened if we'd done that?
Yeah.
Because we wouldn't have been 49ers, but we would have been 59ers about.
Mm-hmm. Did you like those dress blues? Did you?
I really did like the dress blues.
Okay. I thought maybe they were speaking
Well,
to your
and
behalf.
no, and the women,
Yes.
you always wore elbow-length gloves when you did anything formal. And we wore hats. We wore hats and white
right.
kid gloves
Yes.
for everything we were doing.
Oh, different world.
And that was the way it was in Midland when we moved here.
Okay.
And actually, my mother had been on the city council in Ann Arbor when I was in college, and I thought she was absolutely crazy. And I've always laughed about when John and I were courting, they'd sit and talk politics. And then Mother'd say, oh, I'm sorry, and she'd leave and go to bed. And by then John'd say, I have to go to work tomorrow, Randy. So when we moved to Midland, John, it was a depression time, or recession, 1958. And so Dow wasn't able to give John the job that we thought we had when we were coming. And so he got a job with one of our the state senator from Midland. And the first thing that happened was we came in May, and by midsummer, realizing the Republican Party was not going to give them the kind of financial or other support, that they just didn't have it. And so we all became involved in his campaign. We were the campaign.
Oh my, and who was that?
The other partner, well, John wasn't a partner, but the partner's wife. And so we began to become involved in, well, first of all, obviously fundraising, because that was the big thing that the party had. But it's just the fact that because we were getting involved, we both got involved with the Republican organizations, not just the party. They used to have a breakfast club that met one Sunday of every month. And they used to have women's clubs. And so,
Yes.
getting involved in all of those things. And then, strangely enough, before the 1960 election, 58 election, 50, JFK, it was the 60 election. In 59, Dow and the National Chamber of Commerce sponsored an action course in practical politics. And I was very fortunately invited to take the leaders course, which I did. It was a fun thing, because probably 100 people ended up in this community, which at that point in time was probably less than 60,000 people, actually taking the action course in practical politics.
Wow.
Learning about what the law is governing politics and everything else, and actually doing political organization. Mm-hmm. And I loved it. I like organization. and so I just kept on doing it. And then after the 64 election, Ellie Peterson, who was super lady, yes. That a biography of her has just come out.
No kidding.
Within the last couple of weeks. I read the proof on it, but I can't tell you.
I will get it, because I interviewed her when she was stumping for the ERA.
Well, yeah, And anyway, I had been involved in the Goldwater campaign, and so Ellie called me and said, "Come on down to Lansing," and she said, as the first woman chair, as soon as she became the chair, she said, "I need somebody to do women's activities, because there is not a first vice chair to do women's activities, and I want someone who can work with the party women and the women's club women. And would you like to do it?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, all right, I think you should take a tour. So she took me to a map, and she pointed out, I'd never thought in terms of the whole state. The 10th congressional district at that point in time was big enough.
Yeah.
And so that's what I did. And the whole idea was training women leaders and teaching them what they needed to know to be effective and increase the number of women county and district chairmen. And I loved doing it. And then I succeeded Ellie on the national committee that, again, I mean, talk about mentors. That when she had gotten fed up with the national committee after 2 years, she just said, okay, you're running for national committee woman now. I don't think I thought it was that bad. It was okay.
Thank you.
But in part, and I did an interview with someone else talking about the biggest influences on my life, and I talked about my mother and Ellie. And what I finally said, the great thing about both of them were they knew who they were and what they were doing, and they were comfortable in their own skin.
Yes.
And I truly believe that. And I think that's just so much. The law gave them the office, but it didn't empower them. And so they really needed to learn how. And
But you didn't go into the elected political leadership, did you?
well, I was elected within the party,
Right.
but I never ran for public office. I seriously thought about it at one point in time. But I really did have, I think, about a less than a year old.
I was going to ask if that was
and a
okay
3-year-old.
to ask you what was going on at home when you were
Yeah.
traveling all those places that you talked about.
Well, Peggy says she grew up working in Republican headquarters. And the really interesting thing is that even when I was commuting back and forth to Lansing, I would be home by dinner time, and I actually had some good help because this is another one of those things that we grew up believing that families sit down and eat dinner together every night, and our family sat down and ate dinner together every night. And obviously, if I was gone for 5 days, I wasn't sitting down, but John and the kids were, or if John was gone, that we sat down at the dining room table and we had dinner.
Was that
Actually, I stayed on the national committee through the first Reagan administration, so it was until 1984. But at the same time, we started CMF in the early 70s, late 60s, early 70s actually. And in the early 60s, my mother started the Towsley Foundation, I think in 1957 or 58, and my next 3 sisters and I all went on as trustees in 62. Okay. And then my mother was a trustee of the Dow Foundation, and she hated commuting to Midland. And so she finally, after I'd had 1 year experience on the Towsley Foundation, suggested strongly that I should become a trustee of the Dow Foundation at the same time. And so basically, actually, I was in there as essentially, I had 10 years as a trustee before CMF, but being involved in 2 family foundations. And really, in both cases, really taking things very seriously. Neither one was what we call staffed foundation. We had clerical help, but that was it. That we really and truly, and that has been our tradition. I brought the first executive director into the Dow Foundation 6 years ago.
Holy cow. No, 6 years ago.
6 years ago.
Until then, you were doing it.
I was doing it. Or my predecessors as president were doing it with their secretaries. And I'm still there mornings and afternoons when I have to be, and evenings when I have to be, but just because when I'm no longer here, there will not be a family member running the foundation on a day-to-day basis.
And
So-
then your daughter, you have 2 daughters?
I have a daughter and a son.
And they are in other careers, other interests?
My son does all sorts of strange things and lives in Texas. And my daughter happens to be living in Grand Rapids. She is an associate dean of the Michigan State Medical School.
Right.
Yeah,
She might have a few other obligations.
yes. And, and she's a trustee of both
Good.
those 2 foundations. There's no rational thought involved. This is our responsibility. We were given the privilege of having this huge foundation, and it's our responsibility to make sure it works right.
10%.
And
10%.
well, or a fraction of, but
But
no.
that same that sense of
It's
responsibility.
responsibility, and this is it is our privilege, and we really serve it. It's hard for trustees to understand. We really serve at the privilege of the Congress, as a matter of fact. And they're scary when they, and, we're getting into why CMF started, really.
And it's wonderful. This is what I need. I need to hear this too. Have you set the scene for me?
But, and I think that this really is true of many of us who've been involved for a long, long time, that we recognize the fact that we have a very great privilege, and this is true of some of the other people who are not family members, but who are leaders in the independent foundations, that it's a privilege and it's also a tremendous responsibility. And no one else is going to. And the other thing, it is not a substitute for our personal philanthropy.
Oh, I was going to ask you about that.
Absolutely not.
Okay.
That even though we may do matching funds and match, in fact, at the Dow Foundation, we started with matching grants for our staff before we started with our trustees. And this is the first year we're giving our trustees the opportunity, but they have to give by our guidelines, which is going to be interesting. They don't all live in Michigan, and it has to be grants and gifts in Michigan. But no, it is not an excuse for personal giving.
That is interesting. Did you ever want to walk away and just say, just let me go be a person?
No, what would you do? How boring.
I just needed to hear you say that. I have a feeling that that's exactly.
I mean, good heavens. This is fun. It's exciting. You meet so many absolutely wonderful people with wonderful ideas. And sometimes they really do have the capacity to carry them out, and sometimes they don't. And you can be helpful. And I think we, particularly at the Dow Foundation, well, all of the bigger foundations, our role is not just giving money. We do a lot more. We do a lot of convening and facilitating. I don't like people trying to reinvent the same wheel all the time, and so the more I know, the more frequently I say, do you know so-and-so who's trying to do the same thing? Would you like to talk to them? Maybe you should get together. Yes, I can, but let's do the other, because I also think we all evolve in the things we're interested in. And our boards of trustees evolve, actually, particularly in a family foundation. The younger people, obviously, are much more interested in children and early childhood and things like that. And as we grow older, we even start worrying about problems of the aging and a few other things. I mean, those are the obvious examples. But no, going back to in 1968 and 69, and I can remember this actually being an election issue in some parts of rural Michigan, the whole topic of the offenses or alleged offenses of particularly the big foundations like Ford and Rockefeller. And they were unduly influencing the political scene, and they were doing all sorts of horrible things. And foundation-type philanthropy just, it was evil. And a lot of people in Congress, I think, truly believed that what we were doing was bad. And
If I ask
and I
you
can't
why-
give you specific people's names.
No,
I
if
can
ask
tell you
why
because
you
I
really
heard
are
more. I
offended.
heard more from the conservative side about how evil philanthropy is. You give to your church, but that's all you give to. And if you have all this money and you're using it to buy votes or take voters to the polls or whatever you're doing. Anyway, Congress started a big investigation.
And it was Senator Patman.
Wright Patman and a few others.
The Ford Foundation with the Kennedy grants.
Uh-huh.
I have to look all of this up.
See, Dottie's giving you better history than I am.
It's okay,
And
it's
when
not
you
been part of my everyday
get
life
to
like
Russ.
it's about to.
yeah, it is.
Yeah.
And so finally they passed what was called the Tax Reform Act of 1969. And that's when we first were given a mandatory payout. Right now we're required to pay out 5% of our total asset value. At that point in time, it was a floating target that was set, I think, by the Secretary of the Treasury. So we really didn't even know how much we had to pay out. And I'm not positive whether it was TRA 69, but I think it was, that you could not own a controlling interest, which is 2%, essentially, of a major corporation. I mean, now you think about this, and it really sounds strange. But Kellogg, Mott, Kresge all had huge problems. Well, as would we have, because we were nothing but Dow stock. Only we didn't own a major percentage of the stock. We've never owned 2% of the stock. And this kept us out of being, even though in those days we were probably the fourth largest foundation in Michigan. We didn't have that particular problem. We were under the radar. And so Russ Mawby, and I almost know about this more secondhand than firsthand, decided to call a meeting, and it was Russ and Stanley Kresge was still alive, and Kellogg Kresge, Harding Mott from Mott, and Herb Dow, and Harry Tousley were invited. And Herb and Harry decided they wanted to take John Riecker to this meeting as well, so that they'd have their own lawyer there, I think. And I think those were all of the initial the first meeting's initial participants, or at least the first meeting I knew about. And came back with this wonderful idea that we really didn't know whether we were starting CMF or we were starting anything, but to get the major foundations to work together to essentially save the lives of philanthropy, because the outcome of this with the sliding payout and everything else would have been, first of all, they had to diversify, the others had to diversify fast, and it got better, but also you'd end up paying out. You'd have a limited lifetime rather than existing in perpetuity, which basically all of the donors of our foundations want them to exist in perpetuity, I mean, the ones I'm talking about. And so the first conference was organized, and we were called a Conference of Foundations. And 2 days in Ann Arbor at the Marriott, I think, actually wonderful speakers, but also wonderful breakout sessions, because it was people who really and truly cared about what they were doing and really had a stake in the whole thing. I mean, essentially, well, Russ might as well have been a Kellogg, for instance. He was so close to the whole thing and caring so much. But with Harding Mott and with Stanley Kresge and some of the other people who really were still family members. And also we had some educational sessions. And the decision was made, and again, I think it was at that first meeting, that we were a conference, and we would have a conference again the next year, and meanwhile, our marching orders for various people. Harding Mott is the one I think of most, but and when we reached a certain significant size, we would then perhaps become a council. And that probably actually had happened faster than we thought it would. And 75, 75. So that's very fast. Because it became very apparent there was a lot of interest in the field in Michigan to do that. And so we actually became a council, had an office. The first office was in Grand Rapids, and believe it or not, Dottie was not the first the first full-time staff. Someone else was. And it's almost, we haven't looked back since then. And because I was involved in politics, I think even early on, I at least knew my own congressman and I knew my own state legislators, which most people don't, unfortunately. And so I was really interested in becoming involved in that whole public policy part of the thing.
You
And then
chaired the legislative?
we had a legislation committee in Michigan, and I chaired that. Well, Bill Allen chaired it first. Absolutely wonderful person. And then when Bill was gone, I chaired it. By then, Dottie was our executive director and then president. And we were much more formal. But one of the things that, and I have to say this, we were much more board-driven than staff-driven. And that's not because Dottie wasn't the driver, but because Dottie was one of us. and all of the people who were on the board, that original board, were truly, or the original 3 or 4 boards, were truly passionate about the field and passionate about our mission, that we would talk about lobbying to save our lives, that we could do that legally, which sounds funny to actually use that kind of language, and we weren't being extremists, but that was the definition of how we could lobby, was to save our lives, not for other ballot issues or candidates.
And by our lives, you mean the foundations?
For organized philanthropy.
Okay.
The House Ways and Means Committee does have a lot to do with this. And actually, I was being involved in it, and I think I've also been sort of a mentor to a couple of political figures in Midland. One of them is Dave Camp, who is now chair of Ways and Means. But
and I hear he has an interesting history in your life.
he actually was not a yard boy. Bill Schuette was the yard boy, who's the attorney general, but which that probably ties into the public policy part of it as well. But they were best friends and actually next door neighbors. And when Michigan passed the age of majority law, I went out and recruited these 18-year-olds to be precinct delegates. I mean, why not? And sometimes they do turn out to be pretty good. And they became delegates to county conventions and worked campaigns.
Training the next
And they have done very well for themselves. But it has helped, actually, to have Dave Zier. And it's helped all of us in Michigan and because we were actually in Washington meeting with our members of Congress the day that Dave was elected to the Ways and Means Committee. And he was so excited. He took us out to lunch and he picked up the tab. We were supposed to pick up the tab, but he was so excited he paid for it. Well, there, I think you can look at some of the simple things, certainly some of the bricks and mortar things that have happened because of foundation philanthropy, but also individual philanthropy. And this is the other thing, we really do stress. Individuals are still the single largest source of philanthropic dollars, that foundations, corporations, and community foundations really only amount to about 15% of the total philanthropic giving in the United States, which always shocks people.
Yes.
But that takes it again. Your foundation is not your excuse for your personal giving.
Okay.
Certainly a lot of research things that have been foundation supported that never would have been supported if there weren't that extra money. We went through, and I think for a lot of us in the foundation field still, why would we support state universities? That's up to the taxpayers to support state universities. And it's a great story, and I can't speak to every one of the 15 campuses about the difference between what the state support, general fund support does and what their endowments that they're building. Now, all of them do, but the simplest would be with just state support, they would be just basics. We would not have any world-class universities. And having said that, I'll say, since a lot of people like to talk about privatizing the University of Michigan, since they have such a huge endowment, it would take an additional $9 billion in undesignated endowment to replace the state of Michigan's general fund contribution, which gives you a pretty good idea, I think, of how important the state still is.
Mm-hmm.
But it truly is a hard story to tell sometimes, because not Michigan's public education, but another university. I know of a trustee person who said, why would we give to somebody whose endowment is larger than ours? And it is sort of an interesting question.
Yes.
No, it's interesting, and one of the things that I have to say appalled me when I went on the CO at Council on Foundations, the national board, and went on their Legs and Regs committee, is one of the things that makes Michigan unique, truly, is that we actually organized on congressional district levels and had someone in every congressional district who was a foundation leader. And it was the leadership, probably board leadership, even though staff might have been involved, but it was board leadership, who was truly appointed to be liaison with their particular member of Congress. And to a very great extent, we tried to do that with both the state Senate and state House as well. And one of my frustrations when I chaired Legs and Regs on the national level is when the foundations would have what we in those days called Rags on the Hill, or regional associations of grant makers, they'd have one staff person come. And the staff person, frankly, isn't the person who gives to the congressman or takes him out or her out to dinner or lunch or whatever and has their ear and can pick up the phone and get in. And that's just not how you're effective. That you've got to have an ongoing relationship. And it's more than just the donor relationship. And so trying to teach people that you've got to do that kind of thing again. And again, when we go to Washington, we have 3 or 4 people calling up. Set up appointments, agendas. We know exactly what we're going to talk about, handouts. One of the things that Dottie had us doing, I think they still do it, I haven't been able to go the last few years, is to take a printout of all the grants made by foundations within a member's district. And there was one who never wanted to talk to us until finally he got that printout, and then all of a sudden I think probably so he could get the printout again the next year. But that's the kind of effective things. And actually, Dottie Johnson probably deserves the real credit for really getting us organized, having a very specific legislative plan of work on the national level every year. And, you know, we still have interesting things like IRA rollovers that we keep going back and forth on as they happen and don't happen or expire. Well, I'm not going to itemize at this particular moment in time, because there are a lot, right now, some of the things that CMF is working on are pretty esoteric. But Dottie really laid out that whole plan. And she would not claim credit, but when you interview Dottie, she was the person who
I just put that in
said,
my notes.
it's there. And every year we would adopt a plan of work, just the whole legislative plan as a board.
Mm-hmm.
I think I truly believe that it's very hard to lead or anything else effectively if you don't have legitimate factual information. That we're seeing a lot of people right now in the public scene who have no more substance than slogans, and they really and truly don't know what they're talking about. I think there was one who didn't realize that freedom of speech was part of well, it's actually in the Bill of Rights, but it was part of the Constitution. You know, it's just absolutely unbelievable, the lack of information or the proliferation of incorrect information. And I think this is an increasingly great challenge. Mm-hmm. How do elected officials get information on any topic? And even though they have policy staffs, where's the policy staff getting their information from? And frequently, well, who chooses the witnesses to testify before Congress? It's as simple as that. And I think this is truly a problem that needs to be addressed. That's probably the first one. And I'm tying this in with politics, and this is the one place where, unfortunately, in politics, too frequently, the price of leadership is not to be able to really lead.
And why is that?
Well, I guess in part for a legitimate reason that you're trying to build consensus, but on the other hand, a truly insignificant minority can wield enough power to, if they just want to be intransigent, to stop anything from happening. Well, actually, I've been very lucky. I haven't had to have a role with MNA other than to be significant, a friend, very much of a friend, and a funder. And this is one case where I really have had a staff member who's on their board all the time, who is their advocate, but working with MNA, working with the Johnson Center, working with CMF. And I guess my concern is always, they all play very significant roles in the whole philanthropic world. Mm-hmm. And that they play truly, each of them brings something unique to the table. And I think this is very important, and why we really need to keep supporting what all of them are doing. Mm-hmm. That no one group can actually do the whole job and make it work. Why does it work here? It doesn't always work here, but I really think that we're more comfortable in our skin. We are not competitive. Too frequently, if you put a group of nonprofits in a room together, one of the things they're going to say is they're competing for the same dollars. Well, I don't believe that they are competing for the same dollars, because I think the dollars are there if what they're doing brings value to our communities. And if it doesn't bring value, it doesn't matter whether they have a competitor or not. In my old age, I have actually reached the point where I finally told a volunteer board chair that I thought she had the worst executive director I'd ever met. And I think I said it in front of him. Wow. Because the executive directors may be wonderful, turned on, mission is absolutely super, and they don't have two brain cells in their head about anything else. And I think this one happened to be somebody who couldn't explain why he had two named funds at the Community Foundation, because he really didn't know that he did, and that was what got me. And so, for instance, one of the things that the Dow Foundation did, and then Dow Corning did some of it, the last M&A conference, we said we made a donation, and Kyle was very nice and said we could send as many people as we wanted. If the executive director and the board chair or a board leader would go to the conference together, sit in the same meetings, hear the same description of what each of them was supposed to do, and talk about it and bring it back to their board, we'd pay for it.
What a concept.
And actually, Dow Corning picked it up and extended it, I think, into Saginaw and Bay as well. But I am finding that I get more and more frustrated right now with a lot of boards who, and yet you understand it. And again, the executive director also wants a board that is not going to ask questions, but who share their belief in the mission. And they totally cease to be able to meet their mission if they get too internally centered, simply on mission fund. We now have, there are two of us in my generation, and we're the cousins generation on the board. There are two non-family members, which means that there are 8 other people, or there's the potential to be 8 other people, and they are either our children's generation or in some cases grandchildren of our generation who are now coming on as trustees. And so we asked the Johnson Center I guess it's almost a year ago now, to actually do a questionnaire, a survey, whatever you want to call it. We talked a little bit about M&A, and we've talked a lot about CMF. And when Dottie decided to retire, as you know, our gift to Dottie and her passion for Grand Valley was to raise money for the initial endowment that went to the Johnson Center, as well as CMF gave virtually their entire library to the Johnson Center. And I'm not going to be the person to talk about the Johnson Center, but it really is supplying some extremely unique services to the philanthropic world. A lot of the demographic things that they do and the mapping are absolutely fantastic. But for us at the Dow Foundation, one of the things we asked them to do was to put together a survey of our foundation, our trustees, and all of the people who had been members of our associates program. Just to explain that, every year we have representatives out of 6 branches of the family, representatives of 3 branches who are next generation or the generation after that come and be with us as a year. For associates, they can participate in discussion, but they aren't supposed to vote, or their vote isn't supposed to be counted. because frequently they vote anyway. And so all of our trustees and our associates received this survey, which in and of itself had some funny things happen, like the people who said, if you'd send it to me electronically, I would be happy to do it. Yes, we tried 5 times, and we don't have a current address for you, sort of thing. But we actually got pretty good response on it. And it's interesting because we had thought, well, maybe we really and truly do need to go into a strategic planning mode. And the interesting thing is that most of them were reasonably happy with what we were doing right now. But I think in part it's because we really do try to be responsive to what's going on in society today. We talk a lot about donor intent, and for the Dow Foundation, donor intent is for the benefaction of the people of Midland and the state of Michigan. That's virtually our entire limitation. Because Grace Dow gave to every faith-based organization in Midland County, we continue to make a small grant every year to every faith-based organization. But beyond that, we really have had the opportunity to stay relevant. And so we, for instance, have been much more concerned about perhaps career and technical education and an educated workforce in Midland long before the state became, then the role of community colleges long before the state became that interested in them.
Yes.
And that's just one example. Right now, probably our big interest, and I'm getting away from the survey, obviously, but part of the reason is I think that we really have tried to stay relevant. And so certainly there are some really terrific suggestions and technical, but I think our general grant making has stayed relevant to a much greater extent than if we said for the next 5 years all we're going to do is universal preschool. That hopefully by the end of 5 years we're going to have universal preschool taken care of. In fact, I hope we do pretty soon anyway, but at least within our grant making range. I think we know that the interest is there, and it's much more there than it is in higher education. But really it is, particularly because a large number of them, continually larger number of them, don't live in Michigan. It's easy to say, let's do something, but if you don't know what's going on, you don't know what's going on in that particular area. You don't know. I mean, how do you make grants if you don't know anybody who's doing anything in the...
So they need to know
And so-
community.
And they need to know community needs. And I define community. The radius on my circle can get as large as it wants to, just so it's within the boundaries of the state of Michigan, which is sometimes a little hard on some people. But and so we really do spend a lot of time, a lot of involvement. Both my executive director and I, still, both of us serve on more committees than we should. It's wonderful. But it's really not to be controlling. It's the best way we have of actually being involved and knowing what is going on in the field, within the state, and also within our community itself. Sometimes you do need somebody to come in from the outside and say, have you thought about doing whatever? But on the other hand, there are also a lot of very creative people within Michigan. One of my favorite examples is when Moira Corrigan was Chief Justice of Michigan, she actually went around Michigan. And this happened to be one of the places she came. And our probate judge set up a meeting of virtually all of the service agencies and the foundation leadership and local government leadership to hear. And out of this actually has grown a committee called Midland Kids First. But talk, and when Justice Corrigan was here, it started just talking about some of the problems from the Supreme Court they were seeing, particularly with problems dealing with youth. And so we became, the Dow Foundation, very much involved, first of all, with starting, helping to start a program of multi-systemic therapy for troubled youth, teenagers, adolescents, which is in about its 4th or 5th year now. Has terrific response, but multi-MST is involving the whole community, starting with the child and its family, and then moving out to the school, the peer groups, and involving everybody in it. And after we'd been doing that for about 2 years, the probate judge came to me and she said, could we start doing this with sex offenders? I mean, teenage sex offenders. And yes, absolutely. And they've gone into that. Part of the success of this has been very publicly recognized, first by Justice Corrigan to the legislature, and last year by then Chief Justice Marilyn Kelly, again reporting on what was going on in Midland. Another part of what we're sort of involved in, but not as closely, as baby court, which this is interesting, and I think they do it in Genesee County, but I think we're the only 2 counties in the state. And abused and neglected babies, and there are lots of them, unfortunately. And the courts have taken the baby away from the parents, but then what happens? Because the baby's in limbo, basically. And so, first of all, trying to teach parenting skills to the parents. And if the parents aren't willing to learn anything about parenting skill, it sounds terrible when you actually say getting them to terminate parental rights is a success story in some cases, but then that baby has a chance for a future. And so this has been one of the fascinating things that we've done. In other words, we've done quite a bit with the probate court recently. And actually it started we do have a juvenile correction center in Midland. And about half of the residents are Midland kids, and about half are from other parts of the state, I gather. Now, I would just go back to one thing, because I obviously tend to become involved in these things. I mean, at least emotionally involved in them. And sometimes it's very hard to explain, no, this isn't my project. This is somebody else's project. But I've spent a lot of time, so I'll know enough about it to say, yes, this is a good project.
Thank you.
And that's one of the things I think that's the hardest thing to explain to trustees who don't live in the area, who may find out about it when they receive their board packet, if it's a new grant request for the first time. And even when you try to do site visits, it doesn't always work. Doesn't always work that you get the people that you really need to get. Now, we have so many challenges, and we really do have to reinvent society to explain that we can't afford to do it all, as taxpayers can't afford to do it all, that we as individual citizens have to take responsibility for meeting a lot of these needs. I don't believe that some of the things that worked in 1900 are going to work in 2000. We live in a global society nowadays, and people are much more mobile, moving in and out of our communities than they were 100 years ago. They moved in, but they never moved out. People sat down and took a job and stayed forever and ever and ever and ever and raised their family. And that doesn't happen anymore. I mean, in this community, we have people who come in for 3 or 4 years, and then they're gone. Some come back, some don't. They're all over the world.
Yes, yes.
And
Boy, talk about a shifting community
but
structure.
we still have basic needs. We want the best possible school systems. We want best possible recreation. That's why we plant flowers. I mean, about what are the other things we can do to help to keep this community a welcoming community, and welcoming not only people who grew up with English as their first language, but people who are coming in with different cultures and different. Well, this is Ranny saying this is a citizen, but part of our foundation's role is to, obviously, when I came on the foundation, it was we want to make the Midland the best possible community to live and raise a family. Now we have to add, and the best possible community for singles who'd rather be in Chicago or New York or San Francisco or Shanghai or Hong Kong or Singapore.